My name is Mohsen Mostafavi. I'm the chairman of the Architectural Association. I'm here to welcome you to this conference on garden conservation in England, Austria, and Germany. I would very much like to welcome all our speakers from Austria, Germany, and the UK, and of course as well as all the participants. This conference is the first in a series of conferences, hopefully, related to the topic of garden conservation, which really is seen as part of a larger project that will bring together people with a variety of backgrounds, with the knowledge of the work that's being done in different countries for us to share. I think that obviously very, very good work has been done in different countries, but now I think one of the important things for us is really to share this knowledge and to see what can come out of the interaction, in a sense, between the countries, especially as there is more and more material and literature that's becoming available on the issue of garden conservation. At the same time, it seems that it's a fantastic opportunity for us to see what is the relationship between certain aspects of precedent and the possibilities for new projects, because I think that the issue of garden conservation shouldn't always be seen in terms of its relationship to the past, but also, of course, its relationship to a project of the future, to new landscapes and gardens that we might develop in future, and what can we learn from these gardens that have been developed in the past. The speakers who have been invited from Austria and Germany, I think the reason for focusing on Austria and Germany, apparently, I'm told by Ted, became very clear after a series of tours that the students in our garden conservation program made to Austria and Germany, and they discovered that in fact very important, significant, interesting work was being done in those countries, and that is why I think we're starting our first conference by focusing on this topic. I would very much like to thank Ted Fawcett and Axel Griesinger, whose brainchild, in a sense, this conference is, and for all the wonderful effort that has gone into making this a really, really good conference. And I very much hope that you all find it inspiring, provocative, and that we can really learn a great deal from the conference. Thank you very much. Ted.
I'm Ted Fawcett. I'm the person who started this course here. And that was in that room back there in '85. Stood up before 30 or so students, having never taught anybody anything in all my life, and felt very peculiar and odd. But it has gone on. Lots of courses have not, but this one has persisted. Partly, I think, through the very special quality of the AA, which I will, those of you who haven't met it before will absorb during the course of today. When one first meets the AA, one thinks, gosh, and then you realize that it is a place that has a quite particular strength of imagination and thrust of intellect that you don't get in many other places. So we have been extremely lucky to be part and parcel of this ferment. Mohsen has already said that the idea of this course, this conference, came from tours in Germany, where we found it particularly happy talking to colleagues over there who obviously were thinking along similar lines, and the whole thing took off, and it's part of our intention to expand this course into a truly international status. When in, back 65, there was really no academic discipline of garden history at all. With the start of the Garden History Society, it began to come to life. And it has strongly developed until now. It is a very important discipline in this country, and also, as we shall find, in Germany and in Austria. So we're extremely lucky to have speakers today from those two countries. We're not exactly not international ourselves, in that we have at least 3 students here. Benoit Fondu from Belgium, who I don't think has arrived here yet, probably plane trouble. Luigi Berliocchi from Italy, and Mark Scherlen from Luxembourg. And the staff is not without its international quality either. Axel Griesiger, who's already been mentioned, from Germany, and Jan Wijdstra from the Low Countries, sitting at the back. So there is a flavor of the international. But it is to our speakers today that one wants to extend a very special welcome indeed. They've come a long way, and you will hear the top pronouncements from the foremost speakers of Germany and Austria, and we shall have discussion. Discussion has been one of the hallmarks of this course. People who sit with papers and bits of paper in front of them and take down notes don't learn all that much. There are some horrible figures about how much is retained from lectures. Something like 5 to 10% of what is said is retained, unless a great deal of revision recurs. If you're made to discuss things, there is just a chance you may return something rather more. So, you will be made to discuss, and therefore get more out of this conference, we hope. Those of you who knows will know that with this time of year we are always looking for our students for the following year. So do please leave with our coordinator, Helen Keane, any information you may have on people who might like to come, or get bits of paper from her that you can give to your friends, because we like having full courses, and as I say, we have gone on where others have stopped, and we intend to go on going. So please help us on our way. It's now my great pleasure to ask Dr. Gerd Groening to do the first lecture. I find that the introduction that Axel gave me is largely wrong, but we've compared notes with Dr. Groening and translated absolutely indecipherable German, and he will correct me if I'm wrong. He belongs to the Institute for the Theory and History of Design in Berlin, and particularly from the Department of Garden Culture and Open Space Development. Well, let's bang on our subjects today. So, and he's talking about the social background. So, without more elaborate to-dos, because I should probably make a mistake, may I ask Dr. Groening to come and give the first talk. Thank you.
Some technical problems first.
Very good dramatic start.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the special welcome here. I would especially like to thank Axel Griesinger, who invited me to this international symposium about garden conservation in England, Germany, and Austria at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. I'm glad that I can share and discuss some of my views about this topic with you, and I hope to learn at least as much from this symposium as I want to give to you. My topic is aspects of the political and social context of garden conservationism in 20th century Germany. I want to stress that the title deliberately says aspects. I know that I cannot address all of the political and social context of garden conservationism in 20th century Germany within a lecture of an hour or so. There will be gaps in my presentation. I will start with a brief reference to the, in quotes, French connection in garden in conservationism in 19th century Germany. This will be followed by the main chapter about political and social aspects of 20th century garden conservationism in Germany. And within this chapter, I will question the notion of loss in garden conservationism. Then, I will briefly deal about what I call royalism in German garden conservationism. And this will be followed by a part which I have subtitled Oblivion in Garden Conservationism with respect to the Weimar Republic and National Socialism. And here I will especially point to Hans Huth, who seems almost forgotten in German garden conservationism. I will conclude with a very sketchy remark which relates to the more recent aspects in this field. Now, when considering spatial changes of the surface of the Earth in long-range terms, one realizes that human settlements are far from being constant. This is so all over the world, whether we have a closer look at China, at India, Russia, the Near East, Africa, Australia, the Americas, or even good old Europe. Very likely these changes will continue in the time to come. Since gardens always have been and will continue to be a concomitant of world civilization, they will change as well. That is, they will emerge, they will perish, they will be neglected, and they will be cared for. Now about this French connection. In Germany, garden conservationism is a professional phenomenon of the 19th and 20th centuries. It follows earlier attempts in building conservationism, which seems to have originated in France. When, in 1830, Louis-Philippe of Orléans mounted the French throne and made the historian Guizot prime minister, it was his plan to stabilize the government psychologically by memorializing French history. And now I hope we can... Good. It works. Yeah. Now this is a commemoration sheet for the French Revolution, 1789. It's the happiness of liberated humanity. It says freedom, equality, fraternity, and the realm of nature. One of the means of recognizing both the achievements of the revolution as well as the glory of the Ancien Régime was to appoint an inspecteur des monuments historiques and a commission des monuments historiques, whose first act was to provide an inventory which was defined as a critical description of all buildings whose date, architecture, or historical associations made them deserve well of archaeologists, artists, and historians. Thus was created a starting point of great consequence for the future worldwide movement towards the preservation of monuments. In the German state of Prussia in 1843, reflecting the French precedent, a central office was created in Berlin under the guidance of the extremely able von Quast. In curious similarity to the French development, the new movement was popularized by its semi-political appeal. The unfinished Cathedral of Cologne had always aroused national sentiment. Its completion would be a symbol of national unification. So when the project was actually begun, it was widely acclaimed as a patriotic deed and smoothed the path for many other similar undertakings. So what had been a feudal private or feudal clerical interest became deliberately turned into a state interest with the ensuing royal from 1871 to 1918 imperial and following administrations. Obviously, gardens were not of specific concern for these administrations. Traditionally, the design and maintenance of many palace gardens was the responsibility of special court gardeners. Quite frequently, the design of these gardens changed as new owners took over. A park design from the early 18th century could become considered outdated and partially replaced in late 19th century. Obviously, this happened more often than not. In 1892, for example, the board of the Professional Association of German Garden Artists, the Verein Deutscher Gartenkünstler, who had established itself in 1887, noted in garden art other than in painting, for example, regrettable changes and redesigns in the outer appearance of the artworks. The association wished to preserve the most outstanding examples of Renaissance gardens, Rococo gardens, and ultimately the most perfect gardens of the landscape style in their original shapes, plantations, and guiding ideas, but was aware that the realization of this wish will fail due to lack of funds for the executing garden art. 2 years later, in 1894, the same association suggested to edit an inventory of attractive public and private gardens in Germany for use by tourists who related to horticulture. It took, however, almost another 100 years when in 1992 the first list of historical gardens and parks for all of Germany was published by an association which had only very loose ties to professional landscape architecture and art history. So much for the French connection. Now about this notion of loss. The notion of loss, a major element in the 20th century German garden conservationism, ? Quite contrary to the prospectful visionary idea of Arcadia, garden conservationism in 20th century Germany seems to be associated with the sober, dispirited, and past-oriented notion of loss. It even seems to be nourished by the consumption of loss. Additionally, it seems to be apolitical and not particularly social. Just a few examples. In the early 20th century, after the political end of the German Empire in 1919, Karl Heike, the editor of the journal Die Gartenkunst, Garden Art, feared for the loss of the princely garden creations. And here you see one of those more famous princes in Germany. It's Franz von Anhalt-Dessau, and he's pointing to where? To the future, of course. Only a few years later, Heike feared specifically for the loss of Wörlitz, that's the park from Franz von Anhalt-Dessau, this princely park which, once established, was made public from its inception. Its design had been inspired, among many others, by a banker's park in England, the park of Henry Hoare II in Storehead in Wiltshire. In 1928, the art historian Franz Hallbaum demanded a work program for the artistic conservation of the park and gardens at Schwetzingen near Mannheim in South Germany. Hallbaum considered the site, I quote, the most perfect synthesis of two garden styles, that is, the architectonic and the free picturesque, quote end. Instead of losses, Hallbaum referred to difficulties in garden conservation in his program. Hallbaum wrote, and I quote again, "No category of art has to fight such difficulties with respect to quality and conservation of its works as has garden art," quote end. It is remarkable to learn how he founded his claim. Hallbaum focused upon the material, the plants, which make why we call some of the earthy sites shaped by civilization, gardens, and parks, and he found that it is, quote, "the nature of the living material which creates a constant threat to the perfection of the shape and its permanence as a work of art. A garden," he wrote, "is never ready and is constantly embedded in the flow of events. Perhaps at a certain time it may reach the height of perfection as its creator envisioned it. Then, however, decay sets in, and with it the care and responsible work of the caring custodian to provide reserves for aging, dying trees and the value of their shape," quote end. Should, he went on, the need for this care become recognized too late, should the future not become considered year by year in an anticipating way, Hallbaum continued, then the prospects for a garden are bad, quote end. To prove this claim, he pointed out how the tree vegetation which surrounds the so-called circus at Schwetzingen had changed the value of garden art over time, a circumstance which no other category of art has to consider. And I just want to remind you, I don't know if I'm able to see, this is the circus here, and he referred to that circus in Schwetzingen, the surrounding trees, for his argument. In 1921, the first set of guidelines for conservation of the former princely garden sites was published. The guidelines were meant for the new professional administrations in a democratic state, but do not seem to have been particularly successful. The gardens were no longer privately owned, but had become public property. It were no longer princes or kings, but political representatives to whom the garden administrations were subordinated. A political change had taken place which many had difficulties to come to grip with. For example, in his otherwise remarkable program for Schwetzingen, Hallbaum did not address the question of ownership. It seems characteristic of garden conservationism in those years that the 1921 guidelines were published as part of a garden professionals conference report only. Nevertheless, compared to late imperialism in Germany, there was a professionally widened interest in garden conservationism during the Weimar Republic, but it never seems to have made its way into real politics. Almost 2 generations later, Dieter Hennebuhl, the then still only professor for garden history and the leading advocate for garden conservationism in Germany, claimed in 1985, with almost the same words Hallbaum had used in 1928, that, I quote, "In the course of history, no other category of art and monuments has had to suffer from such big losses as has garden art," quote end. Although a new interest in historic gardens had developed in the 1960s, the 1921 guidelines were virtually forgotten until the late 1980s, and even since then, garden conservationism seems not interested in its own history. Instead of a closer look at political processes and democracies, garden conservationism seems to delight in unspecific demands to the state and the communities. Where the professional German Association for Garden Art tended to appeal to itself for the conservation of gardens, and where the art historian Hallbaum pointed to difficulties in actual garden conservation, the garden historian Hennebuhl returned to Heike and lamented German garden losses. The national deploration of physical losses, such as gardens and parks, may well be questioned with respect to the national and international social and personal losses from warfare and political extremism, such as National Socialism and Stalinism. One could add perhaps Maoism, but I'm not familiar enough with Chinese history. Hennebuhl's unspecified statement of the uniquely big losses garden art has had needs differentiation. However, not only along the lines Hallbaum directed in 1928, but also within itself. In the same year of 1928, Gerd had shown already how garden design and maintenance were influenced by feudal ownership, and so did others later on. The loss category Hennebuhl and others refer to applies primarily to design and maintenance standards in parks and gardens, which were owned by a ruling aristocracy or are still owned by some of their no longer ruling descendants. A decline in these standards may mean a loss in perceptible spatial quality, as Hallbaum had explained in 1928 already for Schwetzingen. However, in such instances, the actual quantity of park and garden land is not, in quotes, yet lost. Whereas Hallbaum had feared primarily for, I quote, "the great creations of the architectonic garden style for our historically and artistically most valuable gardens, which date from 1720 to 1820 roughly, and more or less quickly approach the point where their material reaches its natural age limit," quote end, Hennebuhl pointed to, quote, "the external threat and an imminent endangerment of numerous historical and especially the landscaped sites," quote end. Now, if Hallbaum's 1 to 200 year time span were a good rule of thumb, then we should become concerned about all parks between 1798 and 1898 and 1998. But I'm afraid that this is too long a time to leave gardens without ongoing attention. And what about the gardens before 1798 and after 1898? It should be stimulating to research the various design and maintenance standards at any given period of time for sites that were considered parks and gardens by the various ruling political entities. I would be surprised to learn that the parks and gardens were always and everywhere well designed and maintained. That publicly accessible urban parks, many of which were artfully designed, were gained as a result of the political struggle for democracy, and after the first democratic constitution for Germany, the Weimarer Verfassung, had become established in 1919, is hardly mentioned by garden conservationists. And I show you just one example of these more artfully designed public parks, a people's park, Rehberge in Berlin. I won't go into detail, but you see more than the People's Park in Rehberge here. This is the People's Park here. This is the Goethe Park, and this is an open-air swimming area, Plötzensee in Berlin. It was designed in the 1920s, between 1922 and actually finished in 1928. The designer was Erwin Barth. I'll refer to Barth later on. A majority of the inhabitants in the rapidly growing cities of the 19th and 20th centuries may have perceived their new parks as considerable improvements, however. Here, Hallbaum had clearly pointed out a social dimension of garden conservationism. For him, the park maintainers were not only responsible for the artwork of a park, but also had the, quote, socio-ethical obligation to secure and enlarge the amount of the good which had been entrusted to them, quote end. It seems clear that the Weimar Constitution placed within the hands of each citizen a political responsibility which was entirely new to the vast majority of the populace. A major historical shift was to be expected in the relation between the public and many of the parks and gardens which no longer were feudally owned sites. In Dresden, for example, Friedrich Boucher, the head of the earlier Royal Garden Administration, who had been entrusted with the garden administration by a democratic government in 1919, felt obliged to set up public notice against increasing vandalism in the gardens in the early days of the Weimar Republic in 1921. Now, vandalism is obvious for everyone who has an open eye when walking through the gardens. For example, in Sanssouci, and I'll just show you one example, under democratic conditions again in the late 20th century, when you have a closer look at the statue on your right and you look at the left arm, but it's on the right side in the slide there, you see that the hand there has been cut off, or I don't know what. That's happening virtually on a daily basis in many of these beautifully restored places. So for another, it could be stimulating for garden conservationism to learn about the buyers and sellers, the destroyers and designers, the maintainers and the neglectors of land for parks and gardens on state, county, city and private levels, and the degrees to which they not only felt a social ethical obligation, but also acted in a way to redeem it. In 1923, for example, Josef Leibig, then head of the Department for Garden Design at the Higher Horticultural School at Weihenstephan near Munich, Bavaria, had detected a widespread lack of understanding for parks and gardens with the land-owning nobility. How then was the understanding for parks and gardens with the land-owning bourgeoisie, and how with the urban and rural proletariat? Was there then a widespread appreciation of gardens and parks owned by the states, by counties, by communities, corporations, or others? What were the respective qualitative and quantitative increases and decreases? Nobody seems to know yet in Germany. And this is just another example of a people's park in the People's Park Köln-Radertal, designed by Fritz Enke. You have a number of specific design elements in there. In the middle ground, you have what is called a people's meadow. It's this area here. You have a nature theater up here, and other specially designed areas which I won't explain now here. In 1985, for example, Hennebo wrote in a remarkable mix of the development in National Socialist Germany and the first years of democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany with respect to World War II and the post-war development, I quote, "How many historical sites fell prey to the war, that is World War II, and post-war developments is not known," quote end. Georg Biller-Kniehofer, the third chairholder in landscape architecture in Germany at the University of Berlin from 1946 to 1960, seems to have stimulated approaches to answer these questions. In the early 1950s, two of his assistants, Harry Günther, who from 1959 to 1992 headed the garden department at Sanssouci, and Dieter Hennebo, made rough guesses at least. In 1956 already, Hennebo, who went to West Germany that year, had felt that since, I quote, "the opportunities which the great chaos," that is the aftermath of World War II, "has left to us, have been spoiled in many cases. It is our urgent task to at least use the last chance. That's Henneberg's words. In the early 1970s, Günther, who had remained with Pineover in what became the German Democratic Republic from 1949 to 1998, computed a loss rate of some 40% of all parks in East Germany. This rate seems to be based on a list of almost 1,300 rural and historical park sites in the German Democratic Republic, which Günther had published in 1972. In this list, Günther had marked NN some 25% of the sites. That is, sites, I quote from Günther, sites which can no longer be said to be a park and where there are hardly traces of a designed site, and which included sites which have no longer been maintained in pre-war times already. Quote in. Henneberg assuringly joined Günther for the same rate of 40% in West Germany in 1985 by rule of thumb. Now to the point, royalism, prevailing attitude in 20th century Germany, garden conservationism. With respect to professionalism in landscape architecture, considerable irritation was ahead at the beginning of the Weimar Republic, especially so with the tradition-oriented garden artists, many of whom were employed as Herrschaftsgärtner, estate gardeners. And I show you an old English painting here by Thomas Robbins, the elder from 1750, his gardeners at work. Sometimes the positions of court gardeners were handed down over a number of generations. In an as yet mostly unquestioned labeling, such a series of transgenerationally held positions is called Hofgärtner dynasty in German, court gardener dynasty in the 20th century. I think this notion is misleading, but nevertheless popular in German garden conservationism. It is a mix of professional qualification on the side of the gardeners and of political power on the side of the ruling families. It served and still serves to conceal sober analyses of the political and social conditions under which the gardeners had to work. Until 1919, the estate gardeners in Germany were subject to the Gesindeordnung, the domestic servants' order, which had not been changed for centuries and which had not the slightest democratic air to it. It definitely was a far cry away from any of the orders which applied to members of the ruling classes. Not even in their weakest moments would the ruling families have considered to let the gardeners participate in their dynastic quarrels, let alone their economic wealth. It seems telling for the prevailing apolitical, if not royalist attitude, that garden conservationism in Germany has not yet produced a study which would allow to compare the differences of the social conditions in employment over time. The new democratic states of the Weimar Republic made administrative units responsible for the earlier princely gardens. Schwetzingen, which I've mentioned earlier, the earlier summer residence of the Palatine Court, became the responsibility of the State Forestry Department of Baden. Gardens in Thuringia, for example, the fairly famous Belvedere in Weimar, became the responsibility of various authorities for building and agriculture. In Saxony, the earlier court garden direction remained a subdivision of the earlier domestic marshal office in the Saxonian Ministry of Finance until 1922, and after that, a state garden administration as a department of the Ministry of Finance seems to have become established. Now, every now and then, one gets the impression that in the course of the 20th century, quite a few of the garden conservationists in Germany were and still are royalists. They seem to feel like unsuccessful imperial or royal politicians and seem to have difficulties in dealing with democracy. To date, I know of one case only where the social issues have been addressed explicitly. They have not been researched as part of research considered necessary for park conservation on a democratic basis. Empirical research, which would allow to know who visits when and why which historical garden, demanded by Henneberg and myself and recently suggested again by Wolschke-Bullmann, is still missing. Quite a few of those who administered these gardens in the late 20th century still seem to display a royalist attitude. Now, this were consistent with the pre-World War I conservative tradition when the German National People's Party, the Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei, advocated loyalty to the House of Hohenzollern and continued to do so as late as 1928, when Alfred Hugenberg became chairman. This party clearly opposed the democracy of the Weimar Republic. Although the second half of the 20th century incorporates half a century of democracy in a large part of Germany, leading garden conservationists of the late 20th century have difficulties to refer to the first attempts in democracy during the Weimar Republic. What may be understandable on a personal level for court gardeners in the service of princes and dukes, kings, until 1918, who for various reasons continued to work under a democratic government in the same parks and gardens for a number of years, becomes bizarre in late 20th century. When, for example, in 1928, Otto Skell, court gardener until 1918, and later garden inspector in Weimar, has close to nothing to say about the decade between 1918 and 1928, but indulges in almost annual references through the 18th and 19th centuries, which from 1796 onwards include a Skell family history of court gardeners, then this may be due to the feudal tradition which Skell seems to have had difficulties to consider ended. When, however, in 1994, Roland Puppe, a member of the newly established Saxon State Enterprises for Palaces and Gardens, feels able to refer to the history of the state administration of gardens in Saxony during the Weimar Republic in a very scanty way only, this leaves an estranging impression. In a recent article, Puppe did not find a single line for the political and social struggles which shaped the democratic period of the Weimar Republic and how they might have influenced garden conservationism. I cannot compensate for this neglect here. The next point, oblivion in garden conservationism with respect to the Weimar Republic and to National Socialism. In the Weimar Republic, and Bavaria and Prussia, state garden administrations became established, who took over from the earlier court superintendencies. With respect to the political and social development during the Weimar Republic in those states and elsewhere in Germany, a comparable lack of knowledge in garden conservationism exists. The role of Georg Potente, for example, who had been employed at the Imperial State Garden Administration since 1902, had become garden director of the park area at Sanssouci in 1927, and who was pensioned prematurely during National Socialism in 1938, not the least because he was a Freemason, was for the first time addressed in a symposium and an exhibition in Potsdam in 1995. In Saxony-Anhalt, for example, Hans Hallervorden had become garden director of the Herzoglich-Anhaltinische Treuhandverwaltung AG Dessau. Ted, that's another of these beautiful German words. I tried to translate it something like Ducal Anhalt Trust Administration Shareholder Corporation, Dessau, in 1920. And from 1926 onwards was head of the administration of the gardens of the Joachim Ernst Foundation, which included the historical sites in Zerbst, the Georgium and the Luisium in Dessau, Oranienbaum and Wörlitz. On the 1st of April 1939, the National Socialists forced Hallervorden into retirement because he had tried to extinguish the fire which had been set to the synagogue in the Wörlitz Park during the night on the 9th of November 1938, when thousands of synagogues were incinerated in Germany. The synagogue in Wörlitz had been built in 1789 to 90. On the occasion of the 50th jubilee of the reign of Franz von Anhalt-Dessau in 1814, here the first sermon in German had been delivered in a Jewish service. In 1937, National Socialists forced the Jewish community in Dessau to dissolve. For conservation, the Jewish community stored most of their cult instruments in the synagogue in the Wörlitz Park, where they were destroyed then by the fire in 1938. And you see here this building, newly restored building in the Wörlitz Park, the synagogue. Franz Hallbaum, the art historian whom I mentioned earlier with his program for Schwetzingen, and also sometime editor of the journal Gartenkunst during the Weimar Republic, who had published this work program, committed suicide during National Socialism in 1939. The Prinz Pückler Society was actively led into the National Socialist Deutsche Gesellschaft für Gartenkultur, the German Society for Garden Culture, in summer 1933. The Prince Pückler Society had been founded on the 27th of September in 1930 in the Muskau Palace by a small group of people for the purpose, and I quote, to maintain and carry on Prince Pückler's greatest life work, the Muskau Park, quote, end the work of another unsuccessful politician. Count Adolf von Arnim-Muskau became a short-lived first president. Count Pückler-Branitz became deputy president and took over as president on the 11th of October 1931. The Countess Arnim-Muskau was treasurer, and the garden and landscape consultant Hinrich Meyer-Junklausen took the position of secretary. Fairly conservative and looking for a, quote, cozy, homely German cultural landscape, quote end, it is not surprising to learn that this society welcomed National Socialism, quote, with the confident hope that for the great and heavy task ahead of us, our leader will show the right path, quote end. In summer 1933, this society joined the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Gartenkultur, the German Society for Garden Culture, a sub-organization of the National Socialist Kampfbund für Deutsche Kultur, the Fighting Alliance for German Culture, and on 28th of November 1933 became incorporated into the National Socialist Reichsbund Volkstum und Heimat, the Reichsalliance Peopledom and Home. Then the Prince Pückler Society claimed to work, I quote, for the German landscape and Heimat, and thus for the German human, according to the motto, to be German means to do a thing for its own sake, quote end. Weller, a school director and the head of the Cottbus branch of the Prince Pückler Society, founded in 1932, declared one of the most internationally oriented park maniacs in Germany, Prince Pückler Muskau, I quote him, I quote Weller, the creator of a truly German landscape style, quote end. When Weller planned to give a talk about Prince Pückler, a supporter of German civilization, ein Träger deutscher Kultur, on the occasion of the third annual meeting of the Prince Pückler Society in mid-October 1933, he felt he had to cancel it because the National Socialist leader Adolf Hitler gave a radio speech at the same time. This is the quote. The Berlin branch of the Prince Pückler Society was founded on the 22nd of February 1932. Alfred Richard Meyer, who edited Pückleriana as early as 1913 and as late as 1944, and Ernst Gall, the director of the State Administration for Palaces and Gardens, served as president and vice president. The art historian Hans Huth was ready to serve as secretary. Fairly characteristic for the almost perfect sublimation of some aspects of the political and social context of the first half of the 20th century and late 20th century garden conservationism in Germany, Huth is virtually forgotten as a garden conservationist, even in the Pückler Society. And this is what I call oblivion in garden conservationism in Germany. I will therefore take the opportunity to briefly communicate a few of Huth's biographical and bibliographical data. In January 1933, the same year when the National Socialists took over political power, Huth was forced to take a leave of absence as a consequence of the Nuremberg racial laws. As a consequence of this, his wife Martha emigrated to the United States in 1933. Huth's leave of absence was taken back somewhat later because he had participated in World War I, only to become replaced by forced pensioning in 1936. In 1937-38, Huth was in charge of the collections and the library of James Hazen Hyde in Versailles, France. After the beginning of World War II, he left Europe and traveled to the United States in October 1939. A visit to the Grand Canyon, and I'll take you there, brought him in contact to the National Park Service. He applied for a position there and worked for the National Park Service branch of historic sites from 1939 to 1944 as a consultant as late as 1963. After 25 years, Huth published again in Germany in 1958. It was a piece about the origin of the national park idea. Editorial introduction to this article pointed to Huth's book, Nature and the American, 3 Centuries of Changing Attitudes, which had appeared in 1957 and to which the article referred. Aged 71, Huth retired to Carmel, California in 1963. In 1975 appeared another publication by Huth in German It dealt about the palace and the gardens at Schwetzingen, and more publications were to follow. Huth died in Carmel, California in 1977. On the occasion of his death appeared a privately printed booklet in Munich, Germany. On the 11th of November 1979, the then head of the Gardens Department of the West Berlin State Administration for Palaces and Gardens, Martin Sperlich, archaeologists Hans B. Jessen, and others founded a Pückler Society and Pückler Gesellschaft. The difference is the first Pückler Gesellschaft and Pückler Gesellschaft, now without the prince, Pückler Gesellschaft. Its membership grew from about 80 to almost 700 in 1998, and Sperlich serves as president almost ever since. This Pückler Gesellschaft felt given wings to its new activities by England, and I quote, "not entirely without envy for what the garden-friendly, garden-loving England still produces quietly in broadest social strata as a matter of course," quote end, however. Now you see here pencil sketch with the head of Martin Sperlich, the president of the Pückler Gesellschaft, on one of the transactions of the Pückler Society from the year 1989. This new Pückler Society explicitly wants to continue the tradition of the earlier Prince Pückler Society. With Pückler, a garden enthusiast is celebrated, but then there are the National Socialist leanings in the earlier society, which I discovered on the occasion of preparing this lecture. Since the new Pückler Society claims to be interested in critical exchange also, I will add a few more remarks. When I read the speech Hans B. Jessen delivered on the occasion of the first public meeting of the new Pückler Society on the 28th of May 1980 in Berlin, two brief passages struck me. First, there was the notion of pièce de résistance, a piece of resistance, which Jessen attributed to the foundation of the old Prince Pückler Society without further explanation. It seems strange to connect to resistance a group which explicitly wanted to support National Socialism and which seemed not particularly concerned with park issues of the Weimar Republic. Or should the notion of resistance refer openly to the resistance to a democratic constitution, and should this become continued in the early days of the Federal Republic of Germany? Second, in another brief passage, Jessen said the Pückler Gesellschaft wanted to be something, I quote, something like a horticultural conscience in Berlin, quote end. However, I looked in vain for a note for Hans Huth in Jessen's speech. Although he mentioned Alfred Richard Meyer, the former president, and Ernst Gall, the vice president, as members of the Berlin group of the old First Pückler Gesellschaft, he had not a word for Hans Huth, the secretary, who was forced to leave Germany during National Socialism and who never returned. What then is a horticultural conscience? A tendency to avert from social issues seems characteristic of 20th century garden conservationism in Germany. The new Pückler Society also wants to contribute to research for historical gardens, to the reconstruction and the maintenance of parks and gardens. According to its statutes, it remembers the great garden artist Prince Pückler Muskau and wants to support scholarly research of his thoughts and works. It more or less does so, not the least by its transactions, which have appeared irregularly since 1981. What German garden conservationists in the late 20th century still have not addressed is the loss of some of the most beautiful gardens in Europe through the barbarian acts of National Socialism. For example, National Socialist German military vandalized the parks and gardens around St. Petersburg, Russia. The earlier Tsarist park in Peterhof, for example, was described such in an article in the New York Times in 1943, and I quote, "The park itself is littered with distorted trees, headless statues, damaged golden frames of unique Baroque mirrors, and smashed porcelain. The famous Samson fountain was taken to pieces and stolen by the Germans during the period they occupied the whole of the park. Rare books were scattered everywhere, and one of the tasks the Red Army set itself under fire was the collection of the remnants of the libraries." Quote end. And this is a postcard which I happened to buy in one of the visits I could pay to Tsarskoye Selo, but there are similar cards for Peterhof, which shows the situation here of the Pushkin Palace, Tsarskoye Palace, in somewhere winter 1943, and how the rooms have been restored in the upper part of that slide. Another example is, I should rather say was, in Pompeii, Italy. Again caused by National Socialist military action, the newly excavated house of Loreos Tibertinos on the Strada dell'Abbondanza, where besides the house itself, the meticulous reconstruction of the garden provided an unrivaled opportunity to see the special beauty of Roman landscaping and horticulture, was completely destroyed. Now, these are two examples only, and I cannot elaborate on these issues here, since that would need research which is rudimentary at best. And now a brief sketch from garden conservationism in Germany in the second half of the 20th century. As if politics did not matter, Hennebo connected National Socialist World War II and the second attempt for democracy which the Western Allies imposed upon West Germany after 1945, and thus devastatingly assessed the remaining parks and gardens in this time span both in East and West Germany in 1985. Even if such an assessment were real, since many National Socialists continued in office after 1945, this needs more differentiated analysis. It is not yet available, neither for the Weimar Republic, nor for National Socialism and World War II, nor for the development in the Federal Republic of Germany, nor for that in the German Democratic Republic. After some 15 years of physical reconstruction of the destroyed cities and a concomitant unexpected economic growth, new activities in garden conservationism sprang up in East and West Germany in the early 1960s. In 1961, the East German state published an act about the maintenance and the protection of monuments. The list of monuments explicitly included gardens, parks, cemeteries. In 1963, members of the West German Association for Garden Art and Landscape Maintenance, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Gartenkunst und Landschaftspflege, established a working circle for historic gardens, Arbeitskreis Historische Gärten. At a time when many parks and gardens were visited by increasing numbers of people who had increasing amounts of leisure, this circle hoped to find means for the reconstruction and maintenance of parks and gardens. As other groups and circles among landscape architects, garden historians, and others, the circle rather understood itself as an elitist group. You have here a title cover of publication which appeared in 1963 in the German Democratic Republic by Hermann Schüttauf, a garden historian who did a lot for the restoration of gardens in the German Democratic Republic. It says, "Maintenance of Historic Park Sites." Contrary to the small elitist circles for historical gardens, both in East and West Germany, both of these elitist circles in East and West Germany proved rather hapless and helpless. These circles and locally oriented groups were not really interested to awaken, to support, or to keep alive garden use in all social and age groups. Only then, Hennebo realized quite clearly in 1985 the chances for recognition of historic gardens as a prerequisite for their maintenance, and I quote Hennebo, and for the institutionalization and further development of garden conservationism, quote, and will enhance. It took another 12 years after the Circle for Historic Gardens had become established before professional people commenced at the first International Symposium on Garden Conservation in 1975 in Schwetzingen, Germany. Since the German Democratic Republic had issued a Denkmalpflegegesetz, a Monument Maintenance Act, which included monuments of landscape and garden design, such as parks and gardens, cemeteries, ramparts, and alleys, on the 19th of June 1975, this symposium in the Federal Republic of Germany may have been stimulated by the inner German contest for the politically better state. Not long after, a state in Germany, the political status of which has been questioned almost the entire time of its existence, the separate political unit for East Germany and the Soviet Union, and the state of West Berlin for West Germany and the Western Allies, issued an act for the protection of monuments in Berlin on the 22nd of December 1977. Paragraph 2 of this act explicitly mentioned as monuments, and I quote, garden sites, a public site or a cemetery, the maintenance of which is in the interest of the public because of their historical, artistic, or scientific significance, or of their significance for the urban image." Quote end. In 1978, a group of 4 employees began to work as garden conservationists within the Berlin State Department for Open Spaces, which administratively belonged to the West Berlin Senator for Building and Housing, Klaus von Krosigk, who was there from the very beginning, and I think will speak to us later on this symposium. We'll give a closer look at how this group developed within the last 2 decades in Berlin. From a political point of view, this West Berlin development was a breakthrough for democratic state garden conservationism in Germany in late 20th century, and it is a good sign for democracy. However, as late as 1990, the Arbeitskreis Historische Gärten still felt that apart from the state of Hesse, no other state in Germany had issued implementary statutes which would allow to apply state monument laws to historic gardens. As late as 1986, Hennebo hoped, I quote, that the history of garden art and the conservation of its traditional evidence will be considered more than before in the education of all disciplines concerned, especially for future garden architects, quote end. In recent years, however, it appears that more art historians than landscape architects engage in the history of garden art and matters of garden conservation. As the unification of Germany in late 20th century provides numerous examples for the difficulties which arise as concomitants to such a shift in political constitutions, there will be more work ahead for garden conservationism. In Germany, hundreds of parks are on the verge of neglect and in need of maintenance activities. This, however, is very difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, there are signs of hope, and I will conclude with 2 fairly recent examples which may support my view. The first example is the Homo politicus, Friedrich Ludwig Karl von Finkenstein, an unsuccessful politician nevertheless. He had not been loyal to the Prussian King Frederick the Great in a matter of jurisdiction and consequently lost his position as first president of the government in the Prussian province of Neumark in December 1797. Von Finkenstein retired to his estate at Madlitz, east of Berlin, introduced to it the Norfolk way of crop rotation, and delved into the garden art of the 18th century. He even wrote a lengthy garden poem which could qualify as a reference to the 16th century Chinese garden art, and created an outstanding park there. The design of the park, which he described in a fairly comprehensive treatise, followed examples from England. Cared for until the 1940s, but then neglected for more than half a century, the park was restored in the past few years by a descendant of the earlier Count Finkenstein, Karl Wilhelm Graf Fink von Finkenstein, a banker who is now in his 70s. The horrors of Storehead come to mind. The other example is a group of less affluent people who look after the Wiesenburg Park. And this park is located about a one-hour car ride southwest of Berlin. Part of this land became designed in the 1830s, and you're looking down here from the terrace at the castle into the gardens over terraced parterre. The shape of the terrace parterre, with exuberant carpet bedding south of the palace, was created in the last third of the 19th century by its owner, Kurt Friedrich Ernst von Watzdorf, who worked in it from 1864 until 1873. Reconstruction work started in the 1970s on a very small scale and continued so for the years to come, but could barely keep the park from gradual decay. On the 9th of May 1998, just a bare 4 weeks ago, some 50 people founded the Verein zur Förderung und Erhaltung des denkmalgeschützten Landschaftsparks Wiesenburg, another reference to Ted, the Association for the Promotion and Maintenance of the Monument-Protected Landscape Park Wiesenburg. And I think this is the most promising sign for the site for almost 3/4 of a century. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Groening. Now we have David Jacques. He is a tutor here, and his has a distinguished history in garden conservation. His first burst to fame, I think, was in the book Georgian Gardens, The Reign of Nature. If you do not possess that book, you should, because it is undoubtedly the best, I think, book on that period that we have yet had. For the first time, garden conservation was treated from a scholarly point of view, with an extensive use of garden maps in the book, without which one really is talking in vaguely and without precision. And David produced these excellent maps in his book, then setting a new style of, in books of that sort. He's chairman of the Garden Conservation Committee of the Garden History Society and was head of Gardens for English Heritage, where he did outstanding work, which I hope he'll be talking to us about. Are we allowed to say that we hope you're going to become the chairman of the Garden History Society? We may just mention it. Just, yes. We do hope that that is going to happen. I don't think it's an accomplished fact yet, but we are looking forward to that. So, David, will you hold up the English flag?
Wow. Well, I'm going to be talking about political and social context of garden conservation in England. It's difficult, unless one is a political theorist oneself. One's really reduced to sort of reducing bar talk to something that is a reasoned dialogue. So you'll excuse me if not all of my points of view you agree with. This is a personal interpretation of what's happened in my sort of 25 years in garden conservation, and slightly before. I have a few slides, but more importantly, I have a piece of living history halfway through.
I think that's a snide reference to me.
Right. I do want to make it clear that, to me, protection of historic gardens is a cultural statement, and restoration can often be more. It may even be a political statement. So both branches of conservation are thus outgrowths of the cultural and political perspectives of the day. Now, the structure of the talk is like this. First of all, I want to look at various stereotypes with views upon conservation, and then go on to what place conservation has in modern society and how it would best be represented in its image and its rhetoric. Well, the first stereotype I want to look at is what I'm calling the privateer. This is the person who objects to the fundamental principle of conservation that sometimes there's a public interest overriding private rights. We would expect to find landowners and developers and their traditional political voice in the ideological wing of the Conservative Party prominent in their ranks. I think it's worth noting that there's been a fundamental shift in the nature of the privateer over the last century. 100 years ago, the landowning classes were still a mighty voice in British politics. They neutralised the force of successive Ancient Monuments Acts with ease. They were, however, already losing battles on questions of commons and footpaths, in which their opponents were the numerous and powerful urban middle classes. With the rise in income tax and introduction of death duties in the early years of this century, the landowning classes were hurt financially and lost their political potency. These days, landowners, with some justice, regard themselves as a beleaguered class struggling to uphold the economy, traditions and appearance of the countryside in the face of political decisions by a central government that sees the countryside essentially in terms of urban interests. For many years now, landowners have expressed themselves through the Country Landowners Association. This organisation has not been able to exert any real influence on governments, though it has won a string of concessions at various times. Maybe, with the Countryside Rally some months ago, government will in future marginally raise countryside interests up the pecking order. The more powerful advocates of private rights nowadays are, of course, the developers. To them, private rights mean the license to develop. And I have my first slide at this point. Oh, sorry. Just a moment. This is looking at Canary Wharf when you're doing a victory roll. It's interesting that Canary Wharf, which I suppose is the sort of physical symbol of the Thatcher years, was by her described, or by her ministers described, as a planning-free zone. In other words, this is the ghetto for the real privateer. It was, in fact, a Canadian company who I think subsequently went bust. Now, these privateers have become, and the next one, please. Right, okay. These privateers have become very powerful between the two world wars and have remained so. Many of them donate substantial sums to the Conservative Party. Their excesses have been partially checked and controlled through the Public Health and Town and Country Planning Acts. But the power of money often wins in the end. I should say that, rapacious as British developers may often seem to be, they are pussycats compared to American ones. Developers found a congenial government, of course, under Margaret Thatcher, with its rhetoric of reducing the interference from the state and lifting the burden. Perhaps you will remember those phrases. The shift in the Conservative Party's identification of the rightful beneficiaries of private rights was clear in its dismissive attitude to the Historic Houses Association. The Secretary of State for the Environment, Nicholas Ridley, famously advised owners that if they could not afford to keep up their properties, then they should sell and allow the newly rich to purchase. By this he meant those who made large fortunes by managing other people's money in the city, and of course the developers. Now the second stereotype I'd like to identify is that of the, I'm calling them here, the cultural guardians. The early antagonists of the landowners were archaeologists who saw ancient monuments, next slide please, like Stonehenge, as national monuments. Right. Yeah, sure. And sought to give them protection in the nation's interest. These people were, in fact, largely the intellectuals of the landowning classes themselves, seeking to awaken others to their responsibilities. General Pitt Rivers, a substantial landowner in Wiltshire, and the first inspector of ancient monuments, set the tone. Various professors and architectural writers were committed to, and the professional architectural historian emerged in Britain in the first half of this century. Now, these people did not believe in a pluralist society as we might today. They knew what it was to be English and proud of it. They assumed that other educated people would have shared their worldview, and if they didn't, that was because they were not educated. They felt that monuments, instructive as symbols of national culture, should be accessible to all classes and therefore free. Although these arguments have since been undermined in Britain to a very large extent, they still seem to be deployed with effect in France and many other countries. In the 1940s, these intellectual grandees were sufficiently influential to engineer a pact with left-wing Labour government, which envisaged a new world order. And they had the sympathy vote on their side because, of course, the bombing of London had reduced many of our best Georgian squares to rubble. The politicians still admired William Morris, who had argued that buildings and towns resulted from the crafts of our forefathers. In other words, they could interpret heritage in terms of what ordinary people had done to create it, not just in terms of the clients. A compromise was thereby reached, whereby the best of the old was to be protected by ancient monuments and listed buildings designations. Now, curiously, the figure of the self-appointed cultural guardian re-emerged into prominence as the young fogey of the early 1980s. Do you remember the young fogies? It's easy to mock, but these people were asserting what they thought to be traditional values in a changed world in which the politicians were uninterested in cultural matters and privateer developers were rampant. Now, the third stereotype I want to identify is that of the popularists. Many country houses began to open to the public after the Second World War. Some of the staterooms would be opened, and there would be other attractions like model railways or lions to make it a complete day out. Woburn Abbey, why are you laughing? This is what actually happened. Woburn Abbey and Longleat House became famous for thus catering to a newly mobile public. Don't forget, this was the age of the enormous increase in car ownership. As this trend gathered pace, two matters became clear. First, historic houses and their environments were not simply the haunt of architectural historians, but of the masses. Second, there was good money to be had from opening to the public. Not enough, perhaps, to offset the repairs and running costs of a great house, but a very useful source of income nevertheless. I'll give you as an example Harvard House. It was opened in 1950, and it attracted large numbers eager to see the residence of the then Princess Royal. The stable block was pressed into service as a cafeteria in 1959, and a car park was established. The present Earl developed the Bird Garden in 1969 as an attraction for visitors. And also, at the same time, or very shortly after, he created the Adventure Playground. Visitor numbers shot up. In 1967, there had only been 64,000. In 1972, there were 263,000. However, such moves did no service to the landscape by Capability Brown. The car park was pretty awful, but worst of all was the fencing around the bird garden, severing the walks through the southern pleasure grounds. It's only now, in fact, that the Harvard House Trust is attempting to put things right. Well, we probably all have our best worst cases. Perhaps we might nominate Blenheim, where we all know that the car park is a running sore in the conservation of that landscape. In the midst of this was the phenomenal rise of the National Trust. From the 1930s to the 1960s, many owners were only too glad to give their houses and gardens to the Trust in order to avoid death duties. A sort of backdoor nationalisation of the nation's heritage and country houses was underway. James Lees-Milne, who's died recently and was a classic cultural guardian, in my terms, effected the transfer of large numbers of the finest country houses into the hands of the National Trust, perhaps not quite envisaging the results that would flow. His work contributed to making the Trust the largest landowner in England and owning far more historic houses than any other single owner, public or private. Ted Fawcett, who joined the Trust in 1969 as its public relations director, felt that visitors could spend more than just entrance charges. Merchandising of carefully designed or selected products was organised. Old dears were discovered in the locality, and they manned the tills and sold teas. This was a successful formula, complementary and in tone and scale with the place. And meanwhile, membership of the trust was sold from every property, resulting in a huge increase in membership. And at this point, I'm going to ask Ted to give his own sort of interpretation, his own impressions of his time at the trust, a sort of fairly sort of critical time.
Just what you said yesterday. I thought that what I was being asked to do was to talk about guidebooks. That's what David said. And I brought some guidebooks somewhere, hidden in the... Oh, God, I don't know. However, let's see if I have got the brutes out here somewhere. Yes. But I shall spread this now a bit, because it was very extraordinary. I went to the Trust in 1969, and I was called the Director of Public Relations, and I was, the very moment I walked into the National Trust, they said to me, "You must know, Mr. Fawcett, that the National Trust has nothing to do with people," which was an interesting statement, and it certainly meant that one couldn't do worse than what had been going on before. And of course they were right. They didn't have anything to do with people. They were concerned entirely with the preservation of objects. It wasn't until I went to Cornwall a couple of months later, and there, thank goodness, there was an accountant talking at a conference. And he said, "Now, just shut up about being concerned only with things. Every bit of money that comes to the trust comes through somebody. Every bit of property you've got comes through somebody. Every bit of income you have comes through somebody." And after that, there was a slight sort of relaxation amongst my colleagues, and thought that one might be doing a useful thing. We had 170,000 members at that time, and I left it with 1.5 million some 15 years later, so the rate of increase was considerable. But what I thought David was going to ask me to do was to illustrate through guidebooks the way in which the trust... Oh, John, there's John Sayles, who actually knows very much, the only person in the world who knows about this subject, and here I am talking about it. Awful. Head of Gardens at the National Trust. Sit down, John, or you can embarrass me. So, here's the man who really knows all about it. But this is a guidebook for Carlyle's house, as all our guidebooks were at that time, small, discreet, and dark green. And inside is a small amount of information, such as an owner might very well tell to a visitor. Discreet, rather sort of cozy, and not over historical, and certainly not over sort of scientific. The production of this information was simple. Guidebooks, of course, is a completely wrong term. If you were trying to use a guidebook for going around a house or a garden, it doesn't work. You've got to read a guidebook either before you start or when you have finished. When you're going round, what you need is a map of where you are and how to proceed from one place to another, and a fairly simple list of the things you're looking at. with a little bit about them. John was extremely good at reorganizing this as far as gardens was concerned. We had, for a small amount of money, a very nice 3D map came out from almost a standard, which took you round your garden and estate easily, conduct you from one place to another, and tell you a small amount about it. We go on into what was called the standard guidebook, where you have history of the place, descriptions, and a modest number, usually, of black and white illustrations. Never think that one guidebook is sufficient. It isn't. You want the standard one for general purposes, reading before and after. You want your map, and if you want to remember what you saw, you will probably best do so in terms of a sort of illustrated souvenir, glossy pictures. You probably want a children's one as well. I was very unpopular for trying to oust the standard guidebook or to supplement it, because it was said that it would reduce the number of guidebooks that we would sell, standard guidebooks. That meant those guidebooks written by our historic buildings representatives who wished to propagate the sale of their book rather than the sale of anybody else's book. They hid my books under the counter. So they suffered very poor sales until I found them lying under the counter, pulled them on the counter, and the sales did increase rather rapidly. So don't think you only want one kind of guidebook. You may also want a really good connoisseur's guidebook, such as Mark Gerard started for Hatfield, no, not Hatfield. But there's a whole run of these. That's Ham House, a sponsored one. Gardens simply didn't feature in these books to start with. There were only 3 gardens that had come to the trust as gardens: Sissinghurst and Nyman's and Hidcote. The rest had come as part and parcel with the house. They were maintained prettily, tidily, and nicely, but the idea of them as important historic gardens in their own right was rudimentary. I would think that was right, wouldn't you, John? Not really dawned on anybody that they were really very interesting. And it's not until round about the 70s that anybody starts to look at these gardens seriously as historical documents. One of the things that went through my office was the rewriting of the policy leaflets for the National Trust. And I remember the one for gardens suddenly being on my desk and being asked to rewrite it. So I rewrote it as a fledgling garden historian, which was an extremely bold and probably very silly thing to do. But it got printed, and suddenly the National Trust had to acknowledge, even before John arrived, that it had important gardens for an historical aspect in its hands. And by such accidents do very important things happen. So that we ought to perhaps take as a model. And John will go on to tell you about the early restorations within the Trust. But it is astonishing that in so short a time, really from the 70s to now, the whole concept of garden conservation as one of the most important of our arts has come from nothing to a very important status indeed. And I think that's only that this living historical monument, which it was indicated I was, has got to say at the moment, because I don't want to interrupt the flow of Jacques' good talk. But remember, guidebooks aren't guidebooks, and you need quite a lot of different sorts of them if you're going to explain the place that you're on about. So,
thank you, Ted. Thank you very much. So, we have all these great country houses. This is Uppark, transferred to the Trust, and we've just had John Sayles introduced here. From the early 1970s, his predecessor, Graham Stewart Thomas, and then John Sayles himself, found themselves advising on scores of important gardens. I guess the rapidly rising visitor numbers gave them confidence to embark on some groundbreaking restoration projects. I'll just mention them briefly here. First at Westbury Court, a bit dark, a canal garden in Gloucestershire, and then at Claremont, Erddig and Ham House in 1974. In 1979, the Trust's Gardens team pioneered historical surveys by carrying out one at Osterley. The Trust has continued with surveys and restorations to this day, with Stowe being a particularly well-known current exercise. By 1980, the Trust had decided that it must have a marketing man, and the running of the shops lifted to another plane, becoming an end in itself and sometimes overshadowing the presentation of the house. The Trust was the leader in such matters by that time, and private owners followed. Nowadays, every country house is expected to have extensive car parking, high-class loos, a cafe, as well as a shop, which is usually detectable from as far away as the car park by its strong smell of lavender-scented soap products. Now, there was an ideology behind these endeavours of a populist kind. In exchange for the Trust and other owners taking the public's money, which would then be ploughed back into conservation work, the public would receive good value for money in terms of a pleasant and informative day out. Presentation had formerly been neglected, but was now recognised as an important component of this equation. Hence, presentation became a very fashionable profession of the 1980s, being concerned with the entire visitor experience from entering the property to leaving it. This would include interpretation of the place's historic interest, not just by rejigging the guidebooks, but by selecting visitor routes, displaying additional areas like the kitchens, putting on exhibitions, and devising interpretive trails. Yes, it's quite astonishing, actually, the rise in the business of presentation stroke interpretation in the last 20 years. Now, English Heritage was set up in 1984 in this spirit. Its first chairman, Lord Montague of Bewley, was said to be the only owner of a country house that was actually making a profit. Actually, that was because his motor museum was drawing in huge numbers. But the signal was clear, that the government's holding was no longer to be a few monuments preserved in aspic, but should be presented to the public and had to pay for itself, of course. Unfortunately, the hope that English Heritage might emulate the National Trust was forlorn, because most of its properties are unexciting stones in fields, not country houses. But great efforts have been made to rewrite the stuffy old academic guidebooks. In the Department of the Environment's case, it was blue. Do you remember the old blue guidebooks? To rewrite these and to put on exhibitions. More recently, the historic royal palaces were set up, again with a remit to make money, and thereby to alleviate the burden on the exchequer of maintaining them. Now, the critics of this philosophy point out that the purpose of holding the property in the first place, to conserve them for the nation, remember, can become forgotten. At English Heritage, decisions on monuments are no longer taken by inspectors, but by property managers, who often have little background in conservation. Presentation shades off into commercialism under the guise of providing for the public. Did you know that the shop at the Tower of London makes £1 million profit annually? Now, tacky is a word that sometimes comes to mind in thinking of some of the ideas on how to raise revenue. I'm thinking, for example, of various devices to obtain corporate sponsorship from letting out monuments. At the very least, one must recognize that keeping a sensible balance between retaining historic fabric and character on the one hand and its commercial development on the other can seldom be managed to avoid all conflicts. Some of the expensive visitor centres and heritage centres seen in the 1990s are indeed a clear illustration of this. Now, my fourth stereotype is what I'm calling here the grassroots. Whilst all this activity was taking place in the country house, the case for the protection of historic gardens was made, and I would say is now widely accepted, at least at grassroots town and country planning level. This was not inevitable. First, the government organs responsible for the protection of ancient monuments and historic buildings have always been, and are still, shy of espousing the case for gardens, as this is seen as dissipation of their principal purposes. Second, only a few landscape architects and others in the design professions understand and will promote the case for historic gardens. Third, the discipline of garden history has been immature and unappreciated relative to architectural history, so that the case for restriction in gardens has had to be particularly persuasive. Well, garden and park protection won its first significant case when the Garden History Society persuaded the Minister of Transport to reroute a road around Levens Park in Cumbria, and that was in 1970. For the next 25 years, there was a series of set-piece clashes over road proposals, and then from the late 1980s over golf course proposals. So that's Petworth, Highclere, and here Warwick Castle Park were amongst many gains by the Garden History Society, and then from 1987, English Heritage. That's the view back to Warwick Castle from a lodge in the park across the meadows and the River Avon, although rather obscured by bankside planting, you can see winding off through the middle of the view. That was the proposal for turning it into, I think there was, what's 236s? 72 holes of golf course was going to be there, and a club in the with a footprint somewhat larger than the Warwick Castle itself. Now, the statistics of conservation illustrate that the case for gardens is, I think, widely accepted in planning circles these days. In a busy year like 1988, English Heritage was dealing with 100 cases, many involving original historical research and much time spent in public inquiry preparation and attendance. Well, since June 1995, there's been statutory consultation on proposals within sites on the Register of Parks and Gardens. And the Garden History Society has had to process over 500 cases per annum over the last 3 years. This means that the great bulk of local authorities now regularly consult even over the most trivial matters. At the same time, the number of blockbuster cases, in particular public inquiries, has dropped almost to zero. David Lambert hasn't been to a public inquiry now for about 3 years. In other words, most development control planners take advice on gardens seriously. In turn, their advice and perhaps the knowledge of past successes by the garden history lobby are persuading developers and road builders to keep out of historic gardens. Hence, in a quarter of a century, the protection afforded to gardens has undergone a profound shift. Now, I don't wish to imply that everything is rosy, as non-registered sites can still be fair game to developers. Nor would I wish to imply that gardens as a whole are mostly restored or are even better looked after. However, at least the worst threat of catastrophic interventions has been deflected. This situation has not been reached by government action. There are few votes in conservation when it comes to national elections. The economy, law and order, health and education are much more potent issues. Hence, gardens are still not statutorily protected, and the money for restoration is pitifully small compared to the whole problem. It's also regrettable but worth noting that the design professions have been no help either. In the 1940s and 50s, there were many examples of planners and architects being actively hostile to the concept of conservation, which was seen as the antithesis of progress. In fact, one still occasionally encounters residual feelings of this nature amongst some senior local government officers. I do anyway. Great destruction or mutilation of older sections of cities, also of parks and gardens, took place in the 50s and 60s in the name of comprehensive redevelopment. And highway engineers were not informed that open space had intrinsic value and pushed roads through, like Hyde Park here in London, where Park Lane was doubled up, and Stoke Park in Bristol, where a motorway running into the city centre goes straight under the balustrade of Stoke Park House. It continues to shock me, I must say, how little the new generation of landscape designers know or care about the history of their own profession. They are just unaware of the origins of conventional wisdoms and so are poorly prepared for making truly innovative contributions in the future. So if these two groups of people have not contributed, who have? Well, I think you might think of it as guerrilla warfare within the planning system that's made the difference. The system itself, operated at local level, and with its concept of material considerations being determined locally, is wonderfully open to incursions. And a small number of articulate advocates have made a huge influence on local planning authorities. Mavis Beatty was very active in planning and compiling the early unofficial registers in the 1970s and early 1980s. Jeremy Benson managed to get the English Heritage Register written into the Heritage Act of 1983. I myself picked up the conservation flag when I became first inspector of historic parks and gardens at English Heritage in 1987 and made the register a feared planning tool. I also slipped through the first grant scheme for parks and gardens on the back of the great storms of 1988 and 1990. That was Arundel Park before the 1987 storm, and that's the same plantation after the storm had come through. Michael Coop, little known to you I expect, but the chief planner at English Heritage, has always been supportive in advising how to wrangle for favourable wording in circulars and planning policy guidance notes from the Department of the Environment, because that's a crucial aspect of it, getting the government advice straight. David Lambert has been the Garden History Society Conservation Officer during the 1990s and has ensured that the broad spread of local planners are properly advised. Stuart Harding is the driving force behind the Heritage Lottery Fund's Urban Parks programme, with some able assistants who are on the course right now. Now, what sort of group is this? All of those I mentioned understand parks and gardens not just as pretty places, but as representative of noble ideas. All have had their interest in conservation stimulated by close contact and love for particular places. Finally, they've all had planning skills that have allowed them to operate within the system and thereby to employ their love of place on behalf of all parks and gardens. However, I'd see these people, and of course several others too numerous to mention, as merely a symptom of a general feeling of thought amongst persons concerned for their localities. Development control planners often sensitized by the civic trust, got to know and love their patches. Local historians and environmentalists discover that local history and distinctiveness are arguments that do have weight these days. County gardens trusts have emerged in order to celebrate the treasures on their doorsteps. In fact, most people dislike the removal of local landmarks, like trees, of course, and the ordinary person will often protest vociferously, a reaction that is found increasingly to rub off onto local councillors, which is where it matters. Even academia is in tune with this broader constituency, in that we've seen the rise of cultural landscapes over the last decade, a subject that sees places not just as tracts of attractive land, but as redolent in meaning. Now, the fifth and last stereotype I want to come to is a new one, which is New Labour, and their interest in youth culture. Now, returning now to national government, we see an ideology designed to appeal to youth culture. The politicians attempt to be cool, adopting the mindset of smart, wealthy, young urbanites. Supporters argue that we mustn't look into the past and that it's good to give a premium to creativity. Critics would say that this is the me generation with a short attention span, no idealism, and desirous of cultural activities tightly packaged for consumption, and that such a political philosophy is about as shallow as can be imagined. Well, whichever way you see the debate, in practical terms, we see a further crash in esteem for heritage, with falling income to English heritage and other heritage agencies, and antagonism to what are seen as anachronisms. A little bit of inside information tells me that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport was recently spared the sight of beefeaters at the Tower of London. Basically, heritage is anti-progressive, irrelevant, and uncool. Well, that's the climate which we live in today. Now, I think the second part, the shorter part of my talk, is about rethinking conservation and how it's presented. And the first issue I want to talk about is that of creativity. Now, creativity is not, of course, about mere graphic design. It's about the expression of ideas. In fact, all design is in part a reference to the ideas of the past. This indeed is what makes it creative, as fresh and unexpected nuances emerge from every new interpretation and nudge our understanding in new directions. This is how a design tradition grows. It does not spring up fully armed from the ground. Without a generous source of forms, images, and ideas, design is sterile. You could put it another way: if designers are unaware of their sources of inspiration, they're probably not producing anything of inherent worth. Now, this is why the authentic experience is mind-expanding and the wellspring of true creativity. The authentic experience is not, of course, something just to be copied, but it's something to provide lessons on how to do it and what might be achieved. Travel, of course, is one way to transport oneself into intellectually unexpected and challenging situations. Likewise, an appreciation of how others have tackled problems in their own time takes one out of one's present everyday experience into an intellectual voyage and loosens up the imagination. So the common ground between conservation and creativity is thus that both strive for quality of experience, and the joint enemy is dullness and degradation. So conservation is thus about intellectual access. To retain the possibilities of our most meaningful places, we must resist the forms of commercialization that intrude between the observer and the landscape. And we should offer the visitor many points at which to enter the imaginative realm. For example, we can present landscapes not just as the preserves of the owner, but they were the places for members of the family, visitors and estate workers, and many other types of person as well. Conservation is also about cherished memories. This is not just a matter for artists and intellectuals. Everybody has personal memories associated with place and needs identification with place. The concepts of local identity and distinctiveness have taken off because most people have always thought this way, and they immediately understand when you start talking in these terms. Places provide an anchor in an uncertain world. Hence, simplification and loss of individuality and character are a loss of part of oneself and are painful to behold. Now, how do we rethink image and rhetoric? Because that seems to be the only thing that politicians truly understand. I believe there's no good reason why heritage should have a poor image beyond our failure to express its purposes in ways that are meaningful to modern politicians. Conservation informs the imagination rather than shutting it down. Fine buildings and gardens are not conserved for the sake of the stones, mortar and trees, unlike the early days of the National Trust, but as the imaginative wellspring of the past, without which we are condemned to dullness and degradation in the future. Conservation is thus intimately connected with creativity. Conservation is also an expression of the desire for quality of life. The identification of people with place is a grassroots phenomenon, and the desire for conservation that stems from it is an affirmation that pride in local distinctiveness and a sense of identity are important. They may be intangible, but they're aspects to a person's whole sense of well-being. Well, one of the great challenges ahead is to maintain authenticity and differences, and not allow everywhere to be smudged by the processes of decay or poor or low maintenance. Restoration is ever more needed if we're to care about the contribution that design landscapes can make to creativity and the quality of life. As to interpretation, this remains and becomes an even more vital aspect to conservation. Guidebooks, displays, models, and virtual reality should be seen as amongst the devices to inform, but even more importantly, to stimulate the visitor's imagination. I just want to summarize. The common but widespread misconception that conservation is about living in the past profoundly misunderstands its intentions. Conservation is about keeping a landscape's value to the present, and nothing to do with preserving things merely because they're old. And it's time that the garden history world rethought its image and rhetoric to express this.
Once in any conference, we are ahead of time. Fantastic. The morning is now yours. You will sit up now and answer questions, and you please also great. And I will live for round two. And so that we may talk a little about what you perceive as the most interesting points that have been raised so far in the course of the morning's expositions. It's been an exposition rather than discussion so far. So, who would like to ask a question or to put a point of view? Always a difficult subject to start. What do you think about the disaster theory? Dr. Groening's loss is how you expressed it, I think. The loss or disaster, and that is illustrated by David Jacques, though not elaborate. That those two enormous storms that swept through Britain did more to stimulate a desire for the conservation of parks than almost anything else. The sudden elimination of them made people realize their value, what they had lost, talked about Petersburg, the elimination of the great royal palaces of Petersburg and indeed of Warsaw. What did those nations do immediately after the war was over? They started, instead of rebuilding housing in many cases, they started to rebuild royal monuments as symbols of national pride. An extraordinary choice, really. You might think that to invest your money in incredibly elaborate recreations, beautiful recreations. If you build gone to St. Petersburg, gone to Rome, Warsaw, the amount of money poured into conservation, restoration there is fantastic, stimulated by disaster. Have you got any other?
I have
Yes. We've got a lady. Yeah.
Question. Both Dr. Groening and David Jacques talked a bit about the decay of the heritage and the number of parks which actually need a serious amount of attention. But David, you just made the point yourself about the relevance of the historic past and the present. The present shifts in terms of our perceptions all the time. How can we justify investing an enormous amount of money in restoring an innumerable number of sites without some sense of both priorities and of what the present really means in a continuum?
Well, we can't, and that's why we have things like the Register of Parks and Gardens to identify what the priorities are supposed to be in terms of the art historical priorities, and there are other priorities too, like sort of local political pressure and so forth. But there are attempts to prioritise. Nobody pretends that a list of parks and gardens is going. The grading is always, is there, tablet in stone. In fact, one hopes that places will continue to move up and down, something like the register. So, and new types of landscape are being added to the register all the time. I was well aware that it was lacking in public parks, for example. It just didn't have any time to do much about it. But thank goodness that now there is more time and a lot more public parks are coming on, to give one example. I think the way that things happen, certainly in English government circles, is that civil servants, they have a sort of a mechanism to pick up problems on the horizon. So it's a sort of scanning device, and they're always looking for problems. And it's only when you present them with a real problem that they will react. Otherwise, they can relax. So when something happens, like the storm in 1987, they perceive it a problem. Thank goodness the storm was in the southeast of England. If it had been in Yorkshire or Northern Ireland, we would not have any grants for gardens today. But it happened in the right place, and it was perceived that a sort of knee-jerk reaction, we must get this problem sorted out, and so money was voted towards it. And I'm afraid it's only when you present civil servants with problems that they will sort of jump and react and see your case. And it's a sad fact that unless you can continuously make the case that there's a problem to be solved, you're not going to get any money. It's no good just saying, oh, these are wonderful art historical places. No, that doesn't cut much ice.
Good answer. Just a brief comment to that also. One of the things I tried to address was that there is this interest to have a list of where gardens are. And that was voiced in Germany, I mentioned that in 1892, but it took 100 years to produce such a list. So one of the first things is that you can make people aware of where gardens, parks are at all. And then the next thing is setting priorities. But before that is, you could go to many places in Germany and ask people if they knew about historic or, let's say, an interesting garden and park, and you'd find out that people don't even know that. It's just around the corner. So one thing would be just let people know what is there. In Berlin and Brandenburg, we still use a list which has been assembled by the secretary of the first Pückler Society in 1939 as a guideline. It has short entries, about 5 lines for each of those parks, and then already mentions that the park is in more or less derelict state. So that's, we're talking now about the end of the 20th century. We're still using that list, which is not really a perfect list. And then we have that other list, which I mentioned by Harry Günther, published in 1972. Again, only brief notes, parks, some 50 acres, and landscaped or architectonic and that kind of thing. So there's even the most basic information which you could present, and I'm really struck by the amount of publications you have there, and we have that also for a number of sites, but basically not. If you say, well, we should address that problem in schools, now go ahead, and where do you ask that you get 50 leaflets for your pupils in the class just to show the park next door to them? It's not there. We are far from setting priorities on knowing all about the parks there. The first thing would be to just let people know what is around there. In Berlin, we had this difficulty between East and West Berlin. We had some sites which we knew about in East Berlin. We had some sites which we knew about in West Berlin. Now, when you're familiar with the political situation, it's not only Berlin, it's Berlin and Brandenburg, because some of the sites, although belonging to the royal family, are in Berlin, but the others are in Brandenburg. So that's another political issue, to just bring together all of those informations. So the first thing is to know about where the sites are, then you can go on, and of course then there will be a debate which one should be restored or not, but then there's many options. Again, just another.
If I may say something, I mean, it's even more so difficult because what one is looking at is changing all the time. You said that the storm happened at the right place. It also happened at the right moment. Because if you look at gardens, I mean, they are mature or they are starting to get weak. 18th century gardens in 1987 could be in a worse situation than 19th century gardens too. And that's also where the problem lies, because we are in conservation, because we are just working with living material. So where does conservation start? Should we just keep everything or just plant in areas where things have disappeared, or just do what Louis XVI did and what was very brave in Versailles in 1774? All the trees were cut down right after he ascended the throne, because he knew that a garden or at that time one thought a garden would live just for a century, and it had been done, it had been planted at the end of the 17th century, it had to be renewed. That's also where we have to be very cautious, because restoration is some sort of a vague concept. What do you keep from the past, and what do you plant?
But that's not the concept of an English garden or park, that it is dead after a century. I mean, gardens are continually being renewed and adapting. So
yes, but the problem
both gardens and parks. The tragedy is, over the last 100 years, we haven't been doing the same in our parks. We haven't been attending to replanting as we should have been.
Yeah, I'd just like to talk about the difference between conservation and restoration. The two are constantly spoken of as if
Might be as well if the person was scared. Come out, get up, talk towards the back, and they all are.
I really just wanted to say something about the difference between conservation and restoration. That's because the two things seem to be constantly spoken of as being the same. Major restoration takes place because of a failure of management, because of a failure of conservation, and therefore it is an undesirable thing, fundamentally undesirable. You are having to put something back that is basically not authentic. It's conjectural. Whatever level you're on, it's conjectural. You may do your best, but you're not doing the right thing. And what's more, you are presenting something at the end of it which is not likely ever to have been seen before. What is much more important is the regular, routine renewal, updating, improvement, development, which prevents the need for major restoration, which I think is there's far too much of it about, actually, isn't there? Far too much of major restoration. It's an undesirable thing. It's necessary. I quite understand. If you've had a disaster, you've got to do it, haven't you? But fundamentally, it's the priority should be with conservation, with the regular routine, and nobody talks about it because it's not exciting. People much prefer to talk about major restorations. I can show you pictures, and it's much more fun to say this is the before and this is the after, isn't it? And everybody says, what a splendid chap he is, you know. And everybody wants that, don't they? You know, the ego gets inflated. But what is really important is the people on the ground doing the routine work. It's people down there who understand what day-to-day conservation is about, not the people sitting in offices who draw plans. And therefore, I would say that we would need to concentrate in conferences of this kind about conservation. You actually give it that title, don't you?
Conservation.
But I bet most of today will be about restoration.
John? The plunge is absolutely hot into the heart of the battle, and these two are well-known contestants.
Not at all. I've had my fun, I admit, but in restoration, but I fundamentally agree with what John says. Absolutely.
But you don't, it's not just gardeners doing their everyday job. It is the solution to everything, John, as you very well know.
They need direction.
Yes. They need direction, don't they? Because maintenance, steady maintenance, can lead to a total change in the garden. Unless that maintenance is very well and carefully directed by somebody who has got the history of that garden, its particular qualities, its special activities, very carefully thought out. And that is being overseen. And that, of course, is the job of the head of gardens and his gardens advisors in the National Trust, where you have professional people doing that thing all the time with a lot of counterbalances and counterweights also. So it's not, I don't think John intends you to think that you just simply got to let gardeners get on with gardening in order to have perfect conservation. You didn't mean that, did you? He doesn't.
But you've got to have the gardeners, and you've got to pay them.
I don't think we've ever said we should.
Well, it's very important. People think it just happens.
Yes.
Well, the problem is not as simple as it's being made out, is it? We have in many areas, like conservation and restoration of pictures or of buildings, a vocabulary, certain kinds of methods of doing it. For example, there's an Italian school of picture restorers who, if they're dealing with a painting by Jacques, would actually shade in the parts that are being restored and not do it the way Jacques painted it, in order to differentiate the old from the new. For example, when a park burned down, I tried to persuade the National Trust, that some evidence should remain that the place actually burned. This was total anathema to the National Trust, and I believe to be profoundly wrong. That we can't show the continuity of history and the vicissitudes that happened to a garden or to a building or to a painting